Good morning, good evening. Welcome to the Kroxylicious community call for the 3rd or 4th, if you're in the right time zone, of June 2026. Starting with the regular agenda, got the meeting link, the docs in chat, and looks like we've only got one person on the agenda. Peter, over to you.
How's it going? Yeah, so I was doing some investigation work to try to figure out how we can move over all of the different Kafka classes that have unfortunately been moved from where they were before to an internal sub package or whatever. And that's obviously a problem for us because it's a breaking change. And then we were having some discussion about, oh, should we fork the entire code generator that Kafka uses to generate the data classes, for example, or should we try some kind of approach with adapter classes or stuff like that? So I just looked into a couple of different approaches, and the two main ones are: do we fork Kafka's generator, or do we modify our own FreeMaker template, like the one that we have in the Kroxylicious KRPC plugin? And I think we were talking about this in the Kroxylicious Slack for a while, and we were debating which one would be better. And I did have Claude just try to modify the FreeMaker template that we use in KRPC to basically generate all of the data classes. And it seems to be working fine. I also had to generate some tests to serialize both using the real Kafka class and the generated class that we're making with the FreeMaker template. And they seem to be generating matching results. At least the tests are passing. Now, if you guys had a look at the actual code, then you would probably have you'd be better able to verify if they're actually doing the right thing. But as far as I can tell, it seems to be generating code that matches. So the FreeMaker approach seems to be working okay. Now I remember in the Slack we mentioned some stuff about how it'll be very hard to make sure that certain fields work correctly since they're versioned and stuff. I haven't fully looked into that, but the tests seem to be passing, and that runs through all the different versions of the specs. So that approach seems to be working fine as far as I can tell. And on the Kafka generator approach, we were talking about maybe forking it, but then there was problems of, if we wanted to include aliases and stuff like that in the future, that could be a pain. And then there was some back and forth there of, if we did that, then would we want to contribute it back? And then how that could be a problem because do we really want to contribute all of that back instead of just keeping it internal? And that could be a bit of a pain to handle. So right now, I think those are the two approaches available, is using Kafka's generator and our own one. And with the Kafka generator approach, we would just have to hard code some package names are in the source code or whatever. But apart from unhard coding those, again, it's a public artifact, and we can just use it and just call it basically like Kafka calls it, because they just call it using a Gradle task or whatever. So, and one of the parameters is the package name that you want to generate the classes under. So those are the two approaches for generating the data classes. And apart from that, we have all the different record classes like memory records, record batch, and stuff like that. And those are all hand coded. So we would have to unfortunately just fork those, I think. I'm not sure if there's any other approach. We could try the approach where we extend them, where we make some kind of, what do we do? Like we could just make our own like fake class that basically just calls the constructor of the real class. But I'm not sure if that's the best approach because it's kind of complicated and it'll be kind of hard to maintain. So forking them would probably be the best approach as far as I can tell. And then in terms of measuring the drift and stuff like that, which was one of the main concerns, I was looking into some approaches, and the two main ones that I looked into were that, first of all, the tests that I already had written by Claude that are under that branch that I linked under the agenda. Those tests hard code the number of spec files, for example. So if we bumped the Kafka version and the number of spec files changed, for example, then the test would immediately detect that and that would fail. So we know then that something has changed. But if we want to see if the files changed at all, like the source code changed or something, because the tests are already validating that serialized and deserialized stuff is byte for byte valid. If we want to check that the actual code for the spec files themselves is different, one of the approaches that I was looking at is that we could just copy over all the spec files into Kroxylicious under some other package name. And then whenever we bump Kafka, for example, we copy over all of the spec files again. And then if something changed, then it would be very obvious to the reviewer because it would just show up on GitHub or whatever, and you could see exactly the lines that changed. So that would be one of the warning systems. And then was it looking at those another one? Actually, I think that's probably the main one that I was thinking of that would work the best is to just commit the spec files or whatever. I'm
Would
not
it
sure if any of the other approaches work as well.
talk about these in two chunks? It seems to me there might be a natural division between like classes like memory records and record batch, classes which we think we just have to copy and fork and bring those into the Kroxylicious code base. And then we've got the other classes which we can, which we will need to auto generate. So maybe we talk about the two groups separately, and maybe agree a way forward on both of those. Because you're giving us a really thorough summary, but I think you might be going a little bit too fast, or you're probably going too fast for me at 9 o'clock at night anyway.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I know. So again, all of this is I have a link there to the actual investigation, and all of it is run there. Again, this is all like quite complicated since there is a lot to move. I do agree about the thing with the two batches, that approach. The problem is that, of course, that none of these live like by themselves. All of them depend on each other. So even the stuff like the memory records and the record batch and stuff like that, those are used, for example, by the data classes and stuff like that. So we could just move the data classes, for example, but then we'd still be depending on stuff from Kafka like record batch and the other stuff. And if that moved and the filters were depending on that, for example, then we would be again in the same situation where it's like we'd have to move everything again or whatever. So in the investigation, there's some more description there about the scope of how far we want to migrate everything, how much effort we want to put in. But the ultimate full scope would be to just basically remove Kafka clients as a dependency entirely. And of course, that would be hard, but everything is depending on each other. So we would have to think about what to do there.
Keith.
So I was wondering if we break this into two, and as a first stage, we migrate classes like, I've just realized there's a flaw in what I was about to suggest. Because memory records is used by the fetch and produce classes, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the problem. Everything depends on each other.
Right. Okay. So we have to do this in one go. Basically.
I think that's probably the best approach. Now, again, we're not necessarily forced to do it all because, again, not everything is moved. So the biggest concern for us is the breaking change where so much stuff is moved into internal. So for now, we could just fork, for example, the stuff that's moved into internal, and then that would stop everybody using Kroxy from having to migrate twice eventually. But again, that could come back to bite us at the same time, because if we don't move everything right now, then they could have to migrate more than 2 times for all we know.
So if we just like moved, sorry, I can't remember. So does the produce and fetch data classes, do they reference classes like memory records?
I'll have to double check right now because I don't remember. There's like 100-something data classes, but most of them do. Like, let's see. I mean, it's not even necessarily about the data classes. Like even the filters we generate depend on memory records and stuff like that, for example. So even with this internal move, we have to modify all the filters, for example. So we will have to handle it no matter what.
Yeah, I think we need the breaking change. There's 2 breaking changes effectively. There's the breaking change for us as a user of the Kafka API, which we shouldn't be doing, touching the internal stuff, but we are. And then there's a breaking change for our users as we move everything around. And so the question we're trying to get an answer to is it better to make all of our users do 2 changes, as in once to cope with the Kafka internal change and then once to move to our own namespace? or just move to our own namespace in one move. And I think the consensus from the Slack thread was that we should just do it in one move.
Mhm.
The question is, how do we make that move? And so I think the cheapest option is we just copy everything, put our own namespace in place with one-for-one mappings of all the classes, where we just delegate straight through to the Kafka implementations behind them. And that's a really cheap shim. We've got the API in place, we've got everything we need. And then we can just come back and replace that later with a code generator, or a better code generator, rather, actually generating the impulse themselves. Or we stick with the forks class, the shims. I think we could generate the shims quite easily. You look confused, Keith.
I don't think that'll work, Sam, because the user would still end up, if you take a class, any data class which has containers within it.
So you've got to unpick that as you
things. You need to. It would. You wouldn't. The user would still end up having to refer to internal Kafka classes to use those containers.
Yeah, you could have the shim do it, but then it's not a cheap shim.
Mm.
Okay. So that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back to my box. But that's still what the question is. Still, what's the cheapest option to move the user base in one go versus? Yeah, I still think that's our goal. How do we get the user base moved in a single change? And then everything else is just implementation details on that to a certain extent.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, we just kind of have to copy everything over. I'm not sure if there's really an easier way. I was looking into some other ways of maybe just automating or generating everything, like generating the shims or whatever, or again, the whole approach of like, oh, let's just take all the classes we depend on and let's just make our own class that just calls the constructor for those. And then we use reflection or whatever to add, just copy over the methods from those classes that we want into our ones. But then all these different problems arise of, like, I mean, like just usually happens with reflection or whatever, how you can't capture everything. And what Keith mentioned of like, oh, if we make a shim for a class and one of the parameters is another class that belongs to Kafka or whatever, now we have to somehow change that to our own one. That creates a whole mess. So I'm not actually sure if there's any better approach than just copying all of the code.
Yeah, I'm personally in the camp of let's rip the plaster off. Let's remove the dependency on Kafka clients. Let's just fork the code generator, because that seems the simplest way of dealing with the data classes and putting them in our own package. And let's, fork the sort of the memory records and, byte buffer and all of the stuff that we need there, and just put it in our own package. That is a one-time change for people using our APIs, which is, I think, what we all seem to prefer than, sort of a drip of sort of API breakage, compatibility breakage, as, sort of Kafka goes around sort of changing how they're packaging these classes. And, it means that we've got exactly the same sort of functionality as we've got at the moment. There's no sort of horrible, complicated things with shims or reflection or anything. It's basically all code that we are familiar with already. It appears that it's like in our own package name. And yeah, that's not like entirely trivial piece of work, but it's the thing that actually solves the problem permanently. And we're fairly sure doesn't bring with it any other sort of problems that we can't foresee.
Keith?
So I agree with everything Tom was saying there. I think ripping plaster off and doing it in one hit, that is definitely a right approach. We have to write tests. As soon as we copy code, no matter how we do it, we need to write tests to make sure that we've got fidelity with the Kafka equivalents. So for like the data classes, we need to make sure that what we put on the wire is mutually intelligible in both directions for all protocol versions. And for things like memory records, we need to make sure that the binary form of the record that's created by those classes, that's also mutually intelligible between the Kafka implementations and our implementation. And we need to have those tests in place at the point in time we rip the plaster off to know we're good going forward. The part that I diverge with what Tom's suggesting is I would prefer that we don't bring the Kafka code generator in unless we absolutely have to. I think informed by what Peter was saying about the FreeMaker templates, I think if we can put a little bit more time into that and generate those data classes, I think that's worthwhile because it keeps our code generation story within the project simpler, basically. And we've got one way of generating code within the project rather than two. We're a small team. We've got to maintain whatever code we have in the project. So I'd rather not add that blob of generation code if we've got a viable alternative.
So I hear what you're saying. I just have a different point of view. That's code that exists, that Kafka's already using. It's got tests with it already. That seems like much lower risk than trying to sort of have our own thing based on the FreeMaker templating mechanism. Where, yeah, we're going to write tests and so on, but we don't really sort of understand how maintainable those templates are going to be in the future, so either as sort of Kafka continues to evolve. Whereas if we steer close to what Kafka's doing, then, we'd be in a position to sort of, maybe backport, as it were, changes to the code generator that they're already using, rather than sort of constantly having to sort of play this game of re-implementing it in a different technology. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to insist, then I'm not going to make a big sum and dance.
No, I'm definitely not going to insist, Tom. I do see a point of view there. I think I just put slightly different weight on things than you do, but I completely get the point you're making, and they do seem valid as well to me. What do Robin, Sam, Peter? What do you all think?
I think we have consensus on what we want to do and when we want to do it. It's just the how that's now up for the debate. I think we need when we strip the plaster off in one go, and when we do, we need confidence that through testing that we are byte for byte compatible with what goes on the wire. I think as to how we get there, I can see the merits of both sides. The one I don't have a clear picture on is how stable are these classes that we're talking about forking into our code base? How often do they change? And how would we tell that they had changed in Kafka and we needed to do something else? So that's
talking about memory classes like memory records.
Yes. Well, I can see how we tell whether we're byte for byte compatible on the wire with the data classes. That one I kind of have an understanding of, but things like memory records and the other hand-coded classes, how stable are they, and how do we tell when our fork has diverged from upstream effectively?
I can't quite remember how memory records work, but there are methods to basically serialize that to a byte array, aren't there? Have I got that right?
I'm not necessarily. It's slightly more about the wider questions of interactions with it and behavior that it has, not necessarily. Maybe those don't matter. As long as we're byte for byte compatible, we don't care. Maybe.
That's what I was under the impression that if the API ever, if the API drift, then that doesn't matter. What matters is what we put onto the wire, what we're writing to those produce requests and fetch responses. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I guess I'm just questioning the costs of maintaining the fork. How do we tell when the fork changes and whether the fork needs to change in step with the upstream? I guess is the bit I'm trying to get a handle on.
Well, we're trying here to have a stable public API. Memory records in Kafka world isn't a stable public API, so we can't do both.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's much else we can do apart from forking the code we need and then just it's kind of crude, but just watching commit by commit every time something changes and then seeing, does that affect us? I'm not sure if there's any other way. In my fork for the FreeMaker templates, I included some, I looked into like fuzz testing or whatever. I did that for, I think, fetch request and fetch response. So in that approach, for example, I literally just used a JQuick and basically just, because like what else, if you're not watching every commit and then just comparing line of code to line of code or whatever, what else can you do? Well, just try the real one and the one we generate and then just throw every possible input at it and then see if anything has failed. I'm not sure if there's anything else you can do really.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, when you get to memory records, obviously it's got the two sides. You've got the Java API part where we've already got filters, and third parties have already got filters that are basically having to use memory records, although it's not the nicest API. That's the only thing that we and everyone else has been able to use. So we're kind of stuck with that. And I don't think we've really got the bandwidth at the moment to try and design something which is nicer for the proxy use case. So the Java part is fixed, and the wire sort of format of the Kafka's message batch sort of format is fixed as well. And if that was going to change, then that would change with a KIP. And so it's a matter of sort of keeping an eye on any sort of KIPs that might propose sort of message format. I think it would be like V3 at this point. But we'd probably know about that ahead of time. And by sticking with memory records, it would make sort of porting that code over from Apache Kafka, if and when it happens, relatively simple. So yeah, it's not the nicest Java API for a proxy to use for people writing filters. It's a little bit cumbersome, but I think it's doable. I think it's testable. It's obviously coming from very good provenance, and it comes with sort of its own tests. We do absolutely need the test that you were referring to for, Keith, and I think sort of Peter's idea with the fuzz testing is one way of doing that seems like it would be quite maintainable to do that and give us sort of quite good reassurance that we were actually covering the full sort of surface area of what can be expressed there. So I think that would work basically.
So point in time fork of the hand coded stuff, fine, and then we need to pick a code. So does that tell us that we're taking Kafka's code generator, or are we still?
Memory records and friends aren't code generated, so we've still got the code generation technique to agree on.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether we should start with the fork of the upstream one and give it some time to see how it evolves over the next few Kafka releases. I guess we're not doing this immediately anyway. Is this going to line up with 1.0 if we're doing like a hard cut?
We've said we want to do it for 1.0, which
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it has to be a major right if we're completely disrupting everyone. Okay, so it's 1.0. It's sometime in the future. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether we should try the upstream generator for a while, and then we can use JAPIC or something to prove that our free marker 1 is equivalent later if we wanted to switch over.
Sam, what do you think? Do you have any preference?
I'm not strongly on one side or the other. Initially, I was probably slightly more on the free marker side because that's under our control and it's consistent with how we do all our other code generation. I'm quite sympathetic to the point that I don't really want 2 templating systems in the project. But if we can treat the Kafka code generator as a black box, and we're not writing our own templates and trying to use its templating abilities, we're just invoking it the same way Kafka does, just generating to a different package.
From what I saw, it doesn't have templating. It's like print.
Cool. As long as we're not trying to use it for anything other than just generating those Kafka data classes, it's probably not a big deal to have 2 code generation systems. But yeah, I think we need to be careful not to try and use it for anything else. If we wanted to add more behavior to the thing, free marker is probably the way to do, because at least we have a handle on how you build and test and things like that in a consistent fashion. So yeah, I'm probably slightly more on the Kafka generator side right now.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got a majority in favor of going down that route.
Does that give you collywobbles, Keith, or does that come from...
No, it doesn't.
Cool.
Okay, so we're saying we're going to fork classes like memory records and friends.
Yes.
We're going to write tests for those, which make sure what goes on the wire is mutually intelligible between the Kafka version and our version, and we'll need to have some tests there, which are basically part of our test suite. So we keep testing that that's the case. We need to bring in the Kafka code generator and make changes to that forked code to emit things into the packages that we want it to go in. And we need a set of tests that make sure that what we write to the wire is intelligible by the corresponding Kafka data class. That's what I'm seeing as we have to do. And we have to do all that before we get to Kroxylicious 1.0, and we can't upgrade Kafka until we do all of that work.
Well, it doesn't. I was about to say it requires a 1.0 release. It doesn't strictly. We are in 0. We can do a breaking change. So we could do a 0.20, call it 0.30 as a signal, but
I think we were saying we don't want to go to 1.0 without this, but we could, as you say, do another dot release if we wished.
Yes, that's. Rob, you mentioned JAPIC. Did you have a particular test in mind? Because I'm not quite sure I understand how that would give us a wire compatibility test.
Not a wire compatibility test, but just that if we've established our own artifact based on the upstream, then we'd have something to compare if we wanted to just make the first check, okay, all of the methods and things that we're generating are exactly the same through FreeMaker. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes. So that, yeah. So we
Just
don't.
if we decided to later, then we'd have, you know, some baseline to compare.
That's an interesting idea to explore. I don't think we need that one if we're going down the Kafka generator line.
No, we don't. That's like an if we decided that we wanted to unify generation later.
Although
Yeah.
that actually might be a good way of testing whether we've captured or we're not captured, whether we're drifting from the upstream hand-coded classes. If we compare their artifact with our artifact.
I'm not sure there's
module.
I'm not sure there's point putting time into that, because we've said on that issue and in the Slack channel, we value doing things, we value making changes to the data classes to do things like, I think it was aliases was one of the examples that we came up with, where we want to, you know, alias a field to keep backward compatibility, to save, you know, to stop
Yes.
breaking users. So if we'd gone down to some sort of source or bytecode comparison, that's going to blow up at that point anyway. So I wouldn't put time into the source or bytecode comparison at all. I would just go straight for, can we write it to the wire? And those are the tests we need.
Yeah. Cool. Yep, I can live with that position. Have I missed anything off this list here? Keith, Peter?
Don't think so. I think that covers it. Oh, actually, there is one thing that Peter brought up, wasn't there? Peter, you brought up on the issue that there were the OAuth bearer filter that was contributed by, I can't remember the name, contributed now, but that does a server-side OAuth bearer validation. So it relieves the broker from doing that. And that uses the OAuth classes from Kafka directly. Now, I don't think, well, do we want to fork those?
Probably not right now, but I think that's fine, Keith, because if Kafka Clients is no longer a dependency of the runtime and the API, then it can become a dependency for that plugin.
Yes.
And everything still works. So I don't think that's a problem that we need to worry about right now.
I agree. So eventually, when we get to the point where we've got class loader isolation and stuff, for that filter, the Kafka client jar needs to go into that, but that's that filter's problem, and that doesn't pull up to the rest of the rest of a project or the runtime.
I mean, we ought to do ourselves a favor and make it a dependency of that. Make sure it's a dependency of that plugin when we do this work, but it's not impactful until we get class loader isolation. I think, well, yes. I think that's very much that plugin's problem to deal with. It's because it's not using our API anymore, but it should never have been. But yes, I think this gives us a much nicer API story. It scopes it much better to what we're doing and what we want to offer. All right, that's the best part of 40 minutes talking about the Kafka APIs. Does anybody have anything else we ought to be discussing on this call? Because there's nothing else on the formal agenda.
Yeah, I don't think there's. Do we want to dive into triage with the remaining 10 minutes or however much we've got?
It's 5 minutes. I think we can finish here, to be honest.
Yeah, let's.
Cool. Thank you all very much for your time. That was a productive discussion, I think. So, and thank you for all the hard work, Peter. That was a lot of ground to cover quickly.
Thanks, Peter.
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Cheers, folks.
Right. See you around.
Thanks, folks. Bye now.